Hello and welcome out to our Tech Talk today. We're really excited to have each and every one of you come on, taking time out of your day to meet with us. My name is Jared Stone.
I am Corey Willis.
And today we have a special guest. We have Jacob Stanton, who is the IT Operations Manager at Jitterbit. So Jacob, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you, Jared.
Yeah, awesome. So before we move on into today's topic, let's just briefly talk about our most recent Tech Talk. So last month we did one on project organization. So lots of great interaction, lots of great feedback from you all. Everyone seemed to really enjoy that. But for those that maybe missed out on that, where can you check it out, you might say? Well, you can go over to Success Central. All right, that's success.jitterbit.com. And then you can check out our video library. So you can view all of our past Tech Talks. A great resource to have, not only for viewing the videos, but as you'll hear us say at the end today, it's going to be a great resource for you, going forward and building your integrations when you do have those questions that come about. Okay, but one thing, we're really excited again to have another Tech Talk, to have Jacob on with us as a specialist in many areas. But today we're going to be talking specifically about local agents. Okay, now one thing to keep in mind, just like our format in the past, when questions come to mind to you, definitely feel free to put those over into the Zoom chat. We will not answer those immediately, but we will have some Q&A at the end where we will be taking those questions, fielding those, and helping you as much as we can. Okay. So that being said, I said the topic today is going to be on local agents. So the first thing, many of us do understand what a local agent is, but some people may have a question, Jacob, on what's the difference between cloud and local.
Yes, the cloud is a implementation of the local agent. It is a cluster that we as Jitterbit manage. We have a lot of servers out there, and we make sure that it's big, and we can just take care of your load. Now, for the local agent, you have more options. You have the ability to have like Windows authentication. You have the ability to have local plugins. So for a local agent, it is the exact same code base as the cloud, but it is implemented on either your VM or your hardware in your data center, or even in an Amazon data center that is hosted by you.
So Jacob, I know one of the biggest reasons why people would go to a local agent versus the cloud is really the network resources that they're trying to access, right?
Absolutely. The local endpoints, whether that's a local file share or a local database server or a local SAP instance, those are all great reasons to have a local Jitterbit agent.
So typical rule of thumb, if you have data sitting back behind your firewall, we don't ever want to come in and tell you have to expose that out to our cloud agents. That's just not good practice.
Yes.
And so that would be almost a given for a local agent to do that. And we're going to talk about grouping a little bit later as well. But definitely, if you've got network resources, that would be a default reason to go local agent. But there's some other reasons that people might want to do local agents at times, right?
Yeah, there really is. Obviously, we live in an age where security is a very high concern. We always want to make sure that our agents are secure. Well, there is companies that isn't legally allowed to allow their data outside of their network. It has to be local. It has to be in their control. And in those situations, a local agent is a great option. That way, they pull data in from the local endpoint. They push data to their local endpoint, but it never goes into the cloud. And that's another great reason to have a local agent.
Okay,
perfect. Yeah, that's some good information there. So another question that we might have that comes across from time to time, and it gets into the conversation of hardware sizing, is something maybe like, how large should the server be? So
yes. Okay. So we have a recommendations page out there that has some default settings, and this is more than just what is minimum. This is really our recommendations. What we've done is over hundreds and hundreds of customers, we've been on the phone with them. We say, okay, what do you need? What do you want? And this is kind of the average statistics of what happens. And looking from a processor's perspective, if you implement these settings, you're going to wind up with a very reliable server that's going to last you a long time. When it gets to the point and you're really hitting the server hard and you're doing thousands and thousands of operations, come talk to us. Our support team is really good at helping you decide, do you want to increase the specs? Do you want to go with 8 processors? Do you want to go with more memory? Or do you want to go with a third or fourth Jitterbit agent?
So one of the big questions that come, or discussion points that comes up here is, well, how do we know when to add another agent to a group? How do we know when we need to throw more hardware at it? And it's a delicate balance there, right?
Absolutely. It really is a delicate balance. So what we do is we work with customers hand in hand, and we look at the memory, the CPU, the disk I/O profiles. We look at their specific operations. So if your operations are very heavy batch, you're doing huge files, you're doing, let's say, a gig XML, 10 gigs XML, you really want a larger machine. Let's say your memory or your usage profile is completely opposite. You're using APIs, every operation is very small, but you're doing thousands and thousands of them. Well, that use case, you may want to add more servers, not a bigger server. So when we get to the point where you're wanting to add more, you're doing the monitoring, you see that your usage, your CPU is going up. When it gets to that point, we really want to work with you and extend it so that you get the most the best performance for the additional hardware you're going to add.
Okay. Now you mentioned there about monitoring. So, in typical server administration, you've got some best practices that you follow. You monitor things. You monitor your disk I/O, disk
Absolutely.
space, and things like that. Let's get those hardware requirements back up on screen when we can here. There we go. And so, hardware recommendations, and I love how you said it, it's not a minimum requirement. We're not saying that you have to have this, and if you have this, it's going to install, but it's not going to function. I mean, that's how a lot of minimum requirements are out there, right?
Yes, it is.
So we don't necessarily say that. These are the actual recommendations. A quad-core processor, 8 gigabytes of RAM, 50 gigabytes of space. I want to talk about that and park there for just a moment, because the Jitterbit agent only takes, I think it literally takes less than a gig of actual disk space. But there's a reason why we say that we need 50 gig. You want to talk about
Absolutely.
that?
It really has to do with temp storage. So you're processing data, you're going from one source to the other source. Well, we have to have somewhere to store that data while we do the transformation. So we pull it in, we create a temp file in the local server, and then we process that, and then we send it back out. So we usually recommend your temp storage has to be 2x of your largest file that you'll ever process. So we don't think most people are going to be processing a 25 gig file. So we thought it was pretty safe to say if you have 50 gigs free, then you're good to go.
But if you do find yourself in that situation where you're going to be processing tons and tons and tons of files, you may need even more disk space than that.
It's possible.
Or
Or
it's a big if.
It is. Or if you decide to bump up the debug level or bump up the logging level, instead of keeping the standard retention period, you may not want to get rid of those files. You may want to keep them. So by default, we get rid of everything that we don't need. But we do allow you to keep it if you want.
Yeah. So I think it's an important thing to look at, because a lot of times we think about processing files and we don't really realize that the agent's having to pull those in and process it, because we don't retain the data.
Correct.
But we do need that space temporarily to be able to process the data. So I think that's important to note. If you're pulling in a 10 gig file and you've got 8 gigs of RAM, we're not going to load it all into RAM. We're going to put it on the disk, at least at some point there, for temporary storage and processing purposes. Let's see if we can pull those requirements back up one more time there. High-speed internet connection. I mean, that's pretty much out there. I think that's fairly well understood.
Yeah.
But there are times where bandwidth could be an issue.
Yeah, so if you're doing a load that is across a WAN or across the internet, that is definitely something to take into consideration. Let's say you're downloading attachments, for example. A popular endpoint is Salesforce. You're downloading attachments. The internet connection is definitely going to affect the performance of that.
Okay. Yeah, great information there. And those specs, those recommendations can be viewed over on Success Central, for further information there. So moving on, the next thing that we can talk about is agent grouping. So Jacob, what do you have for us on that?
Yeah, so agent grouping is the way that we do clustering. Most customers have an agent group of at least 2. This is for high availability. When a job gets posted to the agent group is going to randomly decide which agent it goes to. It's going to process that. Agent grouping is used for not just for HA, but it's also used for scalability. So you're doing a lot of different jobs. You're really pegging out the CPU. And like I said before, at this point, we have the conversation, do you want to make your machines bigger or do you want more machines? It's also used for DR environments. So if you want an agent group that is totally dedicated for DR, it's in a different data center. You may keep them up and running, you may not. That's when you would have a different agent group. And then during a DR scenario, you would just flip your environment to use a different agent.
Okay. Now you had mentioned earlier about kind of the difference between if you're doing more that scheduled batch type of process versus if you're more API loaded, and how you would make decisions versus larger machines or more agents. So I think that plays into the agent groups here. And we say always have at least 2 in a production scenario.
Yes.
But there might be scenarios where you want more than 2.
Absolutely.
And some of those might be for, just corporate requirements, right? You might have to have 3, 4, whatever, based upon your corporate requirements. But some might be, if you are leveraging more of that API, we do notice a little better performance if we distribute across multiples, right?
Absolutely. So if you have an API request that comes in, it's obviously going to get, just like I said, it uses round robin to attach it to a specific agent. The agent processes it. But let's say you're doing 1,000 per minute. 10,000 per minute. In that situation, you would get more bang for your buck, for example, to go more agents versus a single larger machine. That's really, when it comes to growing like that, it's really where we want to work with you from a support department. Get someone online, do a little analyzing on that data set, and really come up with you for a solution that's going to work well.
Yeah. Now, are there any concerns out there, Jacob, between actually running the agent on hardware versus virtualization? I know virtualization is big in today's IT world.
I don't think there is. We started out a long time ago. Obviously, all the customers had hardware. Nowadays, I would say 80–90% of our customers are using some kind of virtual, whether that's in Amazon or Google, or whether that's on a local VMware. They're virtualizing it somewhere. So we have no problems with using some kind of VM situation. I'd actually kind of recommend it because you got a lot of additional flexibility when it comes to deploying it, whether upgrading it. Obviously, you have to make sure that your VM host doesn't have a ton of other stuff running on it. There is situations where one VM can conflict with the other, but that's just general VM management. It's nothing specific to Jitterbit.
Yeah. So a few things, I just looked over in the chat, and a few things came in specific to this particular topic. So let's sidetrack for just a moment and go ahead and take a couple questions here. One was in regards to the hard disk transfer speed.
Yes.
We said on the requirements 50 megabytes per second storage speed. The question is that burst or is that sustained?
It would probably be sustained. Let me give you a little background on where this requirement came from. We had customers that were using VM environments. They were running 15 or 20 VMs on a single server. That single server had average disk I/O, and it turned out to be they were only getting about 10 megs per second for a specific VM, and it just didn't work so great. So we put in our requirements that the 50 megs per second is a standard serial ATA device. You can usually get about 60 megs per second on one of those standard drives. So we're like, okay, any server grade hardware should have at least a desktop grade hard drive in it. Nowadays with SSDs and RAID SSDs, you're going to probably have a whole lot more than that by default.
So would we recommend sticking to SSDs?
Well, I always recommend sticking to SSDs, no matter what you're doing, whether it's a laptop or desktop or server. So good disk I/O, it just usually helps everything else out. It's usually your bottleneck of your server. So I can't say from a Jitterbit perspective we recommend SSDs, but just from a general server maintenance, I would go with SSDs.
Okay. Now going back to the burst versus sustained, we are only using that transfer, of course, if we're running operations.
Correct.
So if you're running scheduled operations that run, overnight, we're not talking about using 24/7 of sustain.
No, absolutely not. And most of the time, it doesn't reach that point. So when you start an operation, you're going to have some access to the local Postgres caching database, and then it's going to connect to your source, pull in that file, save that local file to your database, or no, I'm sorry, not to the database, save it to that local temp directory. It's going to process that file, and then it's going to upload that file to your target, whether it's a HTTP post or whether it's an FTP or whatever other endpoint you're going to be connecting to. So it is not sustained. It is only during that pull in and that push out that it would be used.
So we're really talking more about having the capacity for the sustainment, but not necessarily that we're going to be sustaining that long term. So when we're talking about the wear and tear on the disk, not too much of a concern point.
It's pretty minimal.
Yeah. So let's move on to another one here. There was a discussion that came in, and we don't necessarily have to put this one on the screen, but let's talk some about the cleanup process with the temp files, because I know we've had some customers at times that go through large process loads, and that cleanup routine. Tell us some about that and how that kind of works, just so our audience can understand where those files are going to be sitting, how long they're going to be sitting, and things like that.
Okay. Absolutely. And there's several different categories of temp files. There's the temp files that are generated intentionally by the user. So the user has a temporary source or a temporary target. There's a temp file that is generated just on the back end that is by the processing. So when you suck a file in from a source, it processes it and then sends it out. Those temp files are deleted at the end of the operation run. Then there's also temp files that are generated as part of the connector. So let's say you have a connector like Salesforce connector, have a results file. So each one of these has a different retention period. The one where the customer brings it in is by default, it's set to like 7 days. You can change that. There is a setting that you can change in the cleanup.xml that will allow you to set it to any time you want. And then there's also the result files. The result files, there's a cleanup retention period. Default is also 7 days, but you can turn them off completely. Like on our cloud agents, the cluster that I maintain, my objective is to keep no customer data. We want to process your stuff and send it back out. Because of that, we've turned the retention period on all the result files to 0. We just don't keep them at all. Now, on a local agent, it's a very convenient feature to know what you processed. So most of the customers leave that enabled.
Gotcha. So this particular scenario that came across, they ended up having a large file runtime. It sounds like the operation failed, and it kind of retained some of that temp data.
Yes. Okay. So failure is a completely different story than success. On failure, the temporary files that are created during the transformation are kept for the default retention period. And like I said, I think it's 7 days. If you have an operation that is sucking in, let's say, a 1 gig file and it's failing, but it's scheduled every minute or every hour, well, you can create quite a bit of temp files there. That's also why we recommend that if you have a failure operation, notify somebody, send them an email, post to Slack, do something that so your administrator can know. And yes, if it fails and fails and fails and fails, you can wind up with a situation where you have quite a bit of disk space used.
So 50 gigs. If you want to bump that up to a terabyte, it's not going to hurt anything.
Oh no, more is definitely not going to hurt anything. We just won't use it.
Yeah.
50, 100, 150. Those are pretty normal numbers for a server grade environment. You want to go a terabyte, 2 terabytes, that's fine. Just won't use it.
Yeah. So just good stuff to know about these cleanup routines, how the local agents process these this data that's coming through, and the monitoring things like your CPU usage, your disk space, your disk I/O, memory usage. Those can all be great indicators on when you might have an issue that you need to dive into a little bit deeper, right?
Yeah, and don't look at peaks, don't look at spikes, look at average. So you're wanting to look at your average CPU over 24 hours, or you may only use your Jitterbit server during the day. So look at the average CPU during the day. You will always see spikes. The Jitterbit agent is designed to consume 100% of the CPU to get the process done as fast as humanly possible. And when it's running that process, it's going to consume that CPU. So that's why I'm saying, don't look at the spike, look at the average over the period of time.
Great. That's a ton of great information there for everyone. So the next and final topic, really, our conversation to be had in regards to agents is operating systems. So maybe give us some information on that, Jacob.
Okay, operating systems is a big conversation that you always have, and I actually find it kind of funny. You always have sysadmins that say, oh, Windows is the greatest, it's so much easier, or Linux is so much better, it's more stable. We at Jitterbit don't really care. You can run it on anything you want. You run it on Windows, you want to run it on Debian or Red Hat or CentOS, that's fine, no problem. We will install and use it just fine. I do recommend that you take your use case into consideration. So does your sysadmins like one operating system better than the other? If they do, consider using that, because they're going to be better at maintaining it. They're going to be more familiar with it. As far as the application is concerned, the main core part of Jitterbit doesn't care. It's going to run just fine on either one of them. When it comes to your endpoints, let's say you have a Microsoft Dynamics endpoint, and that Dynamics endpoint requires you to connect to it with Windows authentication. Let's use Great Plains as an example. Well, obviously, Linux is not going to do Windows authentication like that because it just doesn't really support it. So if you have that requirement that you need to connect to either Great Plains or let's say Microsoft SQL Server that under Windows authentication or one of these other endpoints, consider using Windows. If you do not, well, there's no reason that you can't use a Linux server. It works just fine. I personally, I kind of like it just because of my background. But when it comes to the server itself, there's really very little difference performance-wise or also configuration-wise between the two.
Okay. So really it's your preference. What do you like more?
It is.
A few little use case things that come in.
There is a small, I mean, obviously the OSs are different. Let's say you're doing a ton of file access, so just lots and lots of file access. Well, Linux kind of handles that a little bit better. You're running a local database, Postgres, for example. Linux handles that particular use case a little better. You're doing other things. You're connecting to a Microsoft SQL Server. Well, Windows handles that one a little bit better. Some of the drivers for the Microsoft environment work a little better on Windows. So it really is your use case. We'll be happy to get on the phone with you and go over those use cases. But in general, pick what your admins like to use.
Yeah. So you mentioned something earlier in our pre-show we were talking, and you just mentioned about database. And we didn't necessarily have this on the agenda, but I think it's important for you guys to know about where we install local agents. And one of the things that you mentioned to me is that we don't recommend putting that on another production database server, right?
Absolutely. Okay, so this is a very common scenario where you bring in Jitterbit. You're going to be doing, let's say your local Jitterbit is going to be connecting to your database. It's going to be pushing data out to either NetSuite, Salesforce, or one of these other cloud providers. Well, the mentality is, well, let's put it on the database server. Yeah, probably not a good idea. And the reason is because the database server has a memory CPU profile. Well, Jitterbit also has one. Every application does. Well, the memory CPU profile of the Jitterbit agent happens to be very close to database servers. So when the database needs a lot of CPU, well, Jitterbit's going to be pulling that same CPU. So they kind of don't work so much. They slow each other down. What I would recommend is install the Jitterbit agent on another machine. File server, a processing server, a server with some other memory CPU profile, not your database server. Will they hurt each other on the actual software side? No, they won't. They just slow each other down a little. As far as running Jitterbit on other servers, no problem at all. I mean, we've intentionally moved the ports to ports that aren't used by other things. The application itself really tries to have its own JVM. It has its own version of Java. So even if you have a server that has other things installed on it, it's probably not going to affect it. But at the same time, we don't guarantee because we can't test all the different scenarios. What we do is we guarantee that we'll help you. We guarantee that we'll get on the phone with you, try to troubleshoot it, that kind of stuff. But when it comes to database server, avoid it. I've seen too many problems. It's not a hard error. They slow each other down.
Yeah. Well, speaking of hard errors, and guys, I want to just encourage you, if you've got questions, things that are on your mind, whether it's directly related to the discussion topic or not, that's fine. We're here for you. But put them into the Q&A section in the webinar control panel, and we'll get those. We're going to stay. We always set a rule of thumb here that we stay here as long as you've got questions. So keep those coming over. We've got a couple that are piling up. But I also want to just sidetrack for just a moment. We're going to come right back to this. But I've got another thing, and Producer Mike, I think you've got a survey ready here. There's something that we are contemplating here at Jitterbit, and we are considering, we want your feedback for this, but we are considering coming to a city near you for a Jitterbit Roadshow. And come out there and do some presentations, do a little hands-on workshop, get into the product. And we're kind of curious, what would you like to hear? If we come to a city near you, what would you like to hear? And also, would you be interested in attending? And so I think we're going to try to get that survey out here. Looks like it's up right now. And so if you could take just a moment and just give us some feedback on this, because, I mean, obviously, if we come out to a city near you and you're not really interested in coming out, or if we've got topics that aren't relevant to you, that's not worth us coming. And so we're looking at this, and we just really want that feedback from you to make it as relevant as possible. So while you're doing that, we're going to be taking additional questions here, and I'm grabbing one right now. Here we go. Okay, so speaking of hard failures, coming back to that while people are filling out the survey there. Let's talk a little bit more in detail about where we set those retention periods. You talked about the cleanup.xml.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's in the local agent installation folder, right?
Yes.
And so on Windows, that would be, program files, Jitterbit agent, and then we've got those list of files in there, right?
Yes.
And within there, there's a few key files. We've got things like the jitterbit.conf file, but we also have that cleanup.xml file, right?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that and how somebody would go about changing those, because it definitely sounds like we've got a few people in the audience today that have ran into issues with their local agents where they have ran out of disk space. Mm-hmm. And of course, the agent fails at that point, and even sending out notifications gets challenging and things like that. So they want to be more proactive on that, which is always a good thing.
Yes. Okay. So cleanup, Jitterbit cleanup.xml. We can maybe post the full link to it on Windows, and it's, even if you're in a different operating system, you're in Red Hat or you're in CentOS, the subpath is still the same from the main Jitterbit install path. It's a very simple file. It really is. So there is a service, the Jitterbit cleanup service. It is an independent service. We created it years ago, and it reads this XML file, and then it goes through, and every directory that is inside of it has a retention period. Anything older than that number of days, we delete. On my personal servers, I set it to a very low number because I don't want to keep them. But default on a lot of them, I think, is about 7 days, and some of them may be a little longer. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't really look. But it's just an XML file. Feel free to change the retention numbers in it.
Now, also in the Zoom webinar chat, I just posted a link to our Success Central documentation on cleaning up the drive space, and that goes into the cleanup rules.xml, the location where that's at. So all that's out there. You guys can check that out on the Success Central site for that. So hopefully that helps you there. Let's see what else we have. There was a question coming up. Looks like somebody had experienced a failure where the agent had filled up to a critical point, and even at that point, the email didn't seem to send out. Have you encountered that before?
I haven't encountered it, but it's definitely possible because the email is an operation in itself. So if your disk is so full that it can't create an operation temp file, yeah, I see that. That's very possible. Now let's see. I mean, really, that goes back to server monitoring. It really does. Disk space is probably something that I would recommend you be monitoring in that use case. But as far as Jitterbit goes, I can see how the email would be messed up because, like I said, the email is an operation itself. Every operation that starts has that few little temp files that get created, runs, and then those are deleted. If it can't create nothing, let's say there's 0K, it would not send out. It would error out.
So definitely some things to keep in mind. Going back to the cleanup.xml real quick, just a quick question that came in. Does that accept decimals in the retention period? I don't know if you are aware of that offhand, but
I don't think it does. I'd have to go test it. Really and honestly, I don't know.
Yeah, always a good method. When in doubt, just go.
Yeah, you're not going to hurt anything. So if you put decimal periods in there and you restart the service, it's either going to start or it's not going to start. If it starts, it accepted it and it will work just fine. If it doesn't start, then obviously it didn't like that.
Okay. So here's one more, and guys, keep those questions coming in because that's what we're here for, is to answer your questions. So this one is in relation to a message queuing service. You know, kind of like, hey, we're going to put things into a queue system. Jitterbit's going to pick those up. Now we do have a JMS connector, right?
Yes.
So what can you tell us about the JMS connector and how that could work in a scenario like this?
Well, it would monitor a queue just fine. I don't know that I can tell you much about it. It's the JMS connector.
Yeah.
Monitors for specific queues. If it sees a message out there, it's going to pull the queue down. You have the options. Do I want to delete the message? What options do you want to do with it? At that point, it's going to pass that body into an operation, and then that operation, you can do lots of things with it. At the end of an operation, you also have the ability to post message into a queue, whether that's whatever it was, the result or an ID or any type like that. But I don't know that there's a lot to be said about that. We just allow you to pull messages from it and post messages to it. Usually this is used in a corporate environment where that's the standard, and we're going to be routing a lot of things through there. I don't know. Depends on the use case, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as far as message queues, I think JMS definitely seems to be
It's the most common.
The most common that we encounter, if that's the kind of the route that you're wanting to go for. So let me move over to Jared real quick, because Jared, I know you've got something that you wanted to share about Jitterbit University that may be relevant to some of our audience, and something that's coming up here very soon, right?
Yeah, here in the next, maybe week or so, we're looking to push another course out there for you guys. There's a ton of resources that are available to you. We talked about Success Central at the first of the class here, but success.jitterbit.com. That's a great resource to go and view all sorts of documentation in regards to your integrations. We also have community, the Jitterbit community, which we talked about in our last Tech Talk with the new releases that came about for 9.0. There's a place where you can go and give your ideas through the ideas portal. Just remember, you have to be logged in. You can vote on ideas, and if there's enough, we implement those, right?
So you're saying if there was like another message queuing system that I just really liked, I could put that in the ideas portal and say, could we have something for that?
That would be a perfect place to put that. And
that's a great way to give that feedback of what you are looking for in the product, and for different people to vote on. And that doesn't mean, of course, that anything that's put out there that we're necessarily going to be able to do, but it's a great way to communicate to us on that, right?
Exactly. It becomes visible to our team. And, our goal is to, create a great product that is good for many, many folks. So that's a great way to voice your opinion. But getting back to what Corey alluded to here, at Jitterbit University, we've released some courses this year. The newest one that we released was on plugins, probably a couple of months ago. So that is available for you all.
Now that's developer-centric.
Developer-centric, so you do have to have, some knowledge on Java and whatnot. But if that's your cup of tea, definitely go and have a sip. But we have one, it is for org administrators, okay? So if you're maybe an IT operations manager for your organization,
Jacob.
This is Jacob, this is a great course for you to go through. So like I said, it's probably going to be another week or so before that is available. We're just touching it up, but it's going to be very similar lecture style course that will be, but it's going to be composed of short videos followed by a short quiz just to reinforce some of those key principles discussed. But yeah, that's going to be coming up. We've got a lot of other great learning opportunities that will be available to you throughout the rest of the year. But keep your ears out for that. We'll definitely make sure that information is communicated to you through either your customer success manager or your alliance manager, whomever that may be. We'll definitely make sure the word gets out. So very exciting news there.
Very much so. So organizational administration, one of the things I love in reviewing that course is, we even go into, how do you search the activity logs? Yeah. I mean, just the things that you don't think about until you need them. And we're trying to be more proactive in showing you those methods. How to spin up the agent groups.
Mm-hmm.
How do we drain stop an agent?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Right? If you're going to do maintenance on an agent, don't just shut down the machine.
Yeah, it's not going to hurt the Jitterbit process or the Jitterbit server any, but if you have a job running, it's going to kill it. So yeah, absolutely, drain stop is a good idea.
Yeah, so we cover all that in that course. So back to Q&A, and we've got one here. And Jacob, I'm putting you on the spot.
Oh, this is a good question.
But performance impact, and this particular scenario was that was submitted in inserting records into an Azure SQL database through Jitterbit process, bringing it in from NetSuite. What are some recommendations here? Looking at things like chunking and batch. Now, this is a fairly decent sized record set, over 800,000 there. So what are some things that we could consider to work with this?
Okay, so this is not SQL Server specific. This is any database and this is any source. So they're pulling in from NetSuite, but they could be pulling in from another database. They could be pulling in from a file. They could be pulling in from an XML. That's kind of irrelevant for this. So the key is when you're inserting records into a database, yes, you want to do chunking. You want to have the batch mode on your source. But the real key thing is you want to do that commit on that chunk. You just don't want to send it out there and leave that transaction open. Because let's say you're committing 5,000, 10,000 records at a time. Well, if you're doing millions of records, you could have a lot of transactions that are still open. That's going to really hurt your performance. So committing to a database, large number of record sets. The batch mode is a good thing. Chunking is usually a good thing. And there is a flag. Usually I wind up setting it at the beginning of the operation in a script. It is, I think it's Jitterbit DB or target commit chunks. So if you commit those chunks, every single one of those chunks is committed. That way you don't just build up and every transaction that you have winds up being a little bit slower in the process. This is another great example. We're happy to get on the phone with you and help you with it from the support department. Lydia and her team are awesome. I trained half of them. They're really great people.
You sound like you've been around a while, Jacob.
Yeah, when you're part of a small organization and you come in when there's like 20-something people, you wind up wearing a lot of hats. And over the years, we've grown, become a bigger company. Departments like support and QA have split off. We've hired managers for those. So I've wound up doing a lot of different departments over the years.
Yeah. And I mean, it's pretty common around here. We tend to jump around a good bit. So here's another one that came in. Speaking of drain stopping, going back to that topic for just a moment. Let's talk some about how that works. This particular one says that they have gone through a scenario where they've drain stopped an agent. The management console reports back that the agent stopped, but yet the agent is technically still running jobs. So how does that work? Is that something that we would want to actually dive into because it's unexpected?
That's totally unexpected. So what happens when the drain stop is executed, the Tomcat service breaks its connection to the messaging queue. So it's no longer listening for messages coming in. As far as it's still running and the Tomcat isn't listening, I need to dive into that. That's a one-off. Something is happening, and I don't know what it is off the top of my head.
Gotcha. So here's the principle with that is that if you run into situations like that where you have unexpected behavior, let us know, right?
Absolutely. It may be a use case we don't support. It maybe a bug in the application, but whatever the situation is,
Those happen?
yeah, they do happen. Whatever the situation is, we can't even fix it if we don't know that it happens. And I have seen situations where, well, you're doing something different than everybody else. Now, it doesn't happen often, but I was on the phone with a guy the other day, and he had a very specific use case. Nobody else had that before. And yes, he was having a small problem, but because he called us, we were able to get him a solution and get him back up and running. And really and honestly, it was an opportunity for us to make the product better in the future.
Well, very cool. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. We'll give you just a moment because we want to be here for you. I know we scheduled this one the day before the United States Independence Day, so I know a lot of people are probably out and catching this one kind of on the flip side, so to speak, via the recording. And now, speaking of that recording, that's going to be out on Success Central, right, Jared?
Exactly. So in the next few days, we're going to have this available to you all out at Success Central. It will also be available over on YouTube. So a couple of different ways that you can view the recording for today's session, but not only today's, like I mentioned at the top of the class today, you can view our previous sessions as well. And just, to piggyback off of when things do come up within your integrations that's unexpected, how do you reach support? Do you talk to us through a Tech Talk? No, you don't. But, it would be, reaching out through or reaching out directly to the support channel. And you can do that also at Success Central. There's a nice little button there that will allow you to submit your case to those great individuals to assist you, right? So yeah, that's a way that you can view that information. Micah has the resources. Once again, we can hit on those very quickly. Success Central, great for documentation. Jitterbit University, which is where you're going to learn all things Jitterbit, and then the Jitterbit community. So,
absolutely. Well, everybody, thank you so much for coming out. Jacob, thank you for coming in and being a special guest with us. I hope that everybody enjoyed getting to hear Jacob here and glean from his experience, which is nothing short of amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty massive.
Yeah.
Massive.
So, but yeah, thank you guys so much. And we have actually hit our target time this week of 45 minutes. So we'll see you again on the next Tech Talk. Thank you, everybody.
See you.